The deck plates buckle beneath your feet as another 500-pound bomb tears through the armored hull. Steam hisses from ruptured pipes, mixing salt spray with the metallic taste of blood in your mouth. Around you, men scream orders in Japanese that can barely be heard over the thunder of American dive bombers peeling off their attack runs. You're standing on the bridge of the Yamato, the largest, most powerful battleship ever built. Her 18-inch guns, each barrel longer than a city bus, had been designed to sink entire enemy fleets. But today, April 7th, 1945, those massive weapons are useless against the swarm of carrier aircraft circling overhead like mechanical vultures. The ship lists further to port. Water cascades down flooded passageways where your friends worked just minutes ago. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, 70,000 tons of steel that was supposed to be unsinkable, is dying beneath your feet, and there's nowhere to run. This is the story of the most terrifying 24 hours in naval warfare history, when the age of the battleship died in a storm of bombs and torpedoes. By April 1945, the Japanese Empire was collapsing. American forces had smashed through the Pacific, island by island, leaving a trail of sunken ships and burned-out airfields in their wake. Okinawa, the final stepping stone to the Japanese mainland, was under assault. Desperate kamikaze pilots hurled themselves at American carriers in waves, but it wasn't enough. The Imperial Japanese Navy was finished. Most of their carriers lay on the ocean floor. Their veteran pilots were dead. Fuel was so scarce that major fleet operations had become impossible. But Emperor Hirohito's military advisors hatched one last suicidal plan: Operation Tengo, Heaven Number 1. The concept was simple and insane in equal measure. Send the Yamato, Japan's last operational super battleship, on a one-way mission to Okinawa, beach her on the shore, and use her massive guns as fixed artillery to slaughter American troops. The ship would never return. Everyone aboard knew it. Yamato was no ordinary warship. She displaced 72,800 tons when fully loaded, heavier than most modern aircraft carriers. Her main battery consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a battleship. Each shell weighed as much as a small car and could punch through 3 feet of steel armor at 20 miles. She was built in absolute secrecy at the Kure Naval Arsenal, her construction hidden beneath massive tarps and camouflage netting. When American reconnaissance flights passed overhead, Japanese workers would freeze like statues until the danger passed. The ship's very existence was classified at the highest levels of government. But by 1945, Yamato's thick armor and devastating firepower meant nothing. The age of aircraft carriers had arrived. Dive bombers and torpedo planes could attack from hundreds of miles away, beyond the range of even her giant guns. The Americans had learned this lesson at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese, tragically, had not. On April 6th, Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito received his final orders. Take Yamato and her escorts north toward Okinawa. Engage the American fleet. Fight until ammunition was exhausted, then beach the ship and continue fighting on land. It was a death sentence disguised as a mission, and every man in the fleet knew it. Life aboard Yamato was like living inside a floating steel city. The ship stretched 863 feet from bow to stern, longer than 3 football fields. Her crew of 2,767 men occupied a labyrinth of compartments, passageways, and gun positions spread across multiple decks. The gun crews lived closest to hell. Inside the massive turrets, temperatures soared above 120 degrees Fahrenheit when the main batteries fired. The 18-inch shells required hydraulic hoists to move. Each round stood as tall as a man and weighed 3,200 pounds. Loading them was backbreaking work performed in cramped, poorly ventilated spaces that reeked of cordite and machine oil. Below decks, engine room personnel tended the ship's massive power plant in conditions that resembled a mechanized inferno. Steam pipes ran everywhere, ready to rupture and cook anyone nearby alive if the ship took damage. The constant vibration from the 4 turbines, generating 150,000 horsepower, made normal conversation impossible. Men communicated through hand signals and learned to read lips. The ship's armor was legendary. 26 inches of hardened steel on the main belt, thick enough to stop almost any shell in the world. But this protection came with a terrifying cost. If the ship was hit and began taking on water, those same armored compartments became death traps. Watertight doors, once sealed, couldn't be opened from the inside. Men caught in flooding sections would drown like rats in a cage. Yamato's anti-aircraft defenses had been dramatically increased by 1945. Over 150 guns of various calibers bristled from every available space: 25mm machine guns, 127mm dual-purpose mounts, and experimental rocket launchers. But the crews manning these weapons knew they were woefully inadequate against the hundreds of American carrier aircraft that would inevitably find them. The psychological toll was crushing. Unlike ground troops who could dig foxholes or pilots who fought alone, battleship crews faced death collectively. If the ship went down, nearly everyone died together. There was no individual heroism that could save you, no tactical brilliance that could overcome overwhelming enemy numbers. Worse still was the knowledge that this mission violated every principle of naval warfare. Battleships were meant to engage other surface ships, not sail deliberately into aircraft swarms without air cover. The crew understood they were being sacrificed not for strategic victory, but for symbolic purposes, to demonstrate Japanese fighting spirit in the face of inevitable defeat. Yamato's captain, Rear Admiral Kosaku Aruga, held a final meeting with his senior officers on April 6th. The mood was somber. Some men wrote final letters to their families. Others performed traditional purification rituals. A few simply stared at photographs of wives and children they would never see again. As the great ship prepared to sortie from Cure Harbor for the last time, her crew knew they were crossing the threshold from the world of the living into the realm of the dead. The threats facing Yamato and her crew were unlike anything in naval history. This wasn't a fair fight between fleets. It was a systematic execution by aerial bombardment. American Task Force 58 had been tracking Japanese radio intercepts for days. Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded over 1,000 aircraft spread across 11 fast carriers. His pilots were veterans of 2 years of Pacific combat, men who had learned to sink ships with surgical precision. When Yamato left port, she was sailing into the crosshairs of the most powerful naval aviation force ever assembled. The submarine threat alone was terrifying. American subs prowled every sea lane between Japan and Okinawa like mechanical sharks. The USS Threadfin and USS Hackleback had already taken position along Yamato's projected route. A single torpedo hit in the right place could flood an entire compartment in minutes, trapping dozens of men in rising seawater. But submarines were just the opening act. Picture this. You're a lookout in Yamato's forward superstructure at dawn on April 7th. The sea stretches endlessly in all directions, deceptively peaceful under scattered clouds. Then you spot them, tiny specks on the horizon that shouldn't be there. Your blood turns to ice as you realize what you're seeing. Aircraft bearing north-northeast, many aircraft. The specks grow larger. Grumman F-6F, Hellcats diving out of the sun. Curtiss SB-2C, Helldiver bombers loaded with 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs. Most terrifying of all, Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers skimming just above the wave tops, each carrying a Mark 13 torpedo designed specifically to rip open ship hulls below the waterline. The American pilots had studied Yamato's blueprints, stolen by intelligence operatives years earlier. They knew exactly where to hit her. The torpedoes would target the ship's sides below the armored belt where the hull was thinner. The bombs would aim for the lightly armored deck areas around the superstructure and gun turrets. Yamato's anti-aircraft guns opened fire in a thunderous barrage. Tracers streaked across the sky in glowing arcs. The 127mm guns hurled time-fused shells that burst in black puffs of shrapnel. But the 25mm machine guns, the ship's primary defense, were woefully inadequate. Their effective range was under 2,000 yards. The American torpedo bombers could launch their weapons from 3 times that distance. Seaman First Class Yoshida Mitsuru, manning a portside 25mm gun, watched in horror as the first wave of Helldivers began their attack runs. The bombers came down at 70-degree angles, nearly vertical, building up tremendous speed before releasing their ordnance. The 1,000-pound bombs fell like black teardrops against the gray sky. The first hits came at 12:37 p.m. A bomb penetrated the forward deck and exploded in the crew quarters, instantly killing 30 men. Another struck near the base of the mainmast, severing electrical cables and plunging entire sections of the ship into darkness. The lights went out in the engine rooms. Emergency battle lanterns cast eerie shadows on steel bulkheads. Then came the torpedoes. The Avengers approached from multiple directions simultaneously, a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm the ship's defenses. Yamato's captain ordered hard turns to port and starboard, but the massive ship responded sluggishly. She was simply too big, too heavy to dodge modern aircraft. The first torpedo struck amidships on the port side with a tremendous underwater explosion that lifted the entire vessel. In the flooded compartments, men were thrown against steel walls with bone-crushing force. Seawater poured through ruptured hull plates in torrents, and the ship immediately began listing to port. Damage control teams raced through smoke-filled passageways carrying wooden beams and collision mats, desperately trying to shore up failing bulkheads. But Yamato's design worked against them. The same compartmentalization that was supposed to limit flooding now trapped repair crews in sections of the ship that were rapidly becoming uninhabitable. In the forward engine room, Chief Petty Officer Tanaka felt the ship shudder as another torpedo found its mark. Steam lines ruptured, filling the space with scalding vapor. Men screamed as superheated water stripped flesh from bone. The lucky ones died quickly. As the attacks continued, Yamato's list increased. Water sloshed in the lower decks, making movement treacherous. The ship's massive weight, once her greatest strength, now became her weakness. Every ton of seawater that poured into her hull brought her closer to the point of no return. The American pilots showed no mercy. Wave after wave of bombers and torpedo planes pressed home their attacks with methodical precision. This wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. At 1:15 p.m., Yamato took her death blow. A spread of 4 torpedoes from VT-17 Avengers struck the port side simultaneously. The explosions were so powerful, they lifted the battleship's bow clean out of the water. In the depths of the ship, men were crushed by shifting machinery. Others were drowned as the sea rushed in through gaping wounds in the hull. The list increased to 15 degrees, then 20, then 25. In the main engine control room, Lieutenant Commander Yoshimura knew the ship was dying. Water cascaded down ventilation shafts like mechanical waterfalls. The port turbines were flooded and useless. Only the starboard engines still functioned, but their power was barely enough to keep the ship moving. Counterflooding starboard compartments. The order echoed through the ship's communication system. To prevent capsizing, the crew had to deliberately flood the starboard side to level the ship. It was a desperate measure that would only buy them minutes. The extra weight would drag Yamato deeper, making her an even easier target. On the bridge, Captain Aruga remained calm despite the chaos around him. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead where flying glass had struck him. The ship's compass spun wildly. Navigation equipment sparked and failed. Through the shattered windows, he could see American aircraft circling like vultures, preparing for the final kill. The counter-flooding worked temporarily. Yamato's list decreased to 10 degrees, giving the illusion of stability. But it was a death sentence disguised as salvation. The ship now rode much lower in the water, her deck awash with every wave. At 1:45 p.m., the second major attack wave arrived. 50 more aircraft, bombers and torpedo planes working in perfect coordination. The pilots had been briefed on Yamato's weaknesses. They knew the ship was already mortally wounded. This was the coup de grace. The bombs came first. A 1,000-pounder penetrated the armored deck near the aft turret and exploded inside the ammunition magazine. The blast was visible from 20 miles away, a column of orange flame that climbed into the sky like an atomic mushroom. The entire stern section disappeared in the explosion, taking 300 men with it. Seaman Yoshida, still at his 25mm gun position, felt the heat wash over him like the breath of a furnace. When the smoke cleared, he couldn't recognize the ship he was standing on. Yamato's elegant lines were gone, replaced by twisted metal and gaping holes. The final torpedoes struck at 2:02 p.m. 8 Mark 13s, launched from different directions, converged on Yamato's starboard side. The ship had no chance to maneuver. Her rudder was jammed. Her engines were failing. She wallowed in the water like a wounded whale. The explosions came in rapid succession. Boom, boom, boom. Each one closer to the ship's vital center. The fourth torpedo struck directly beneath the forward turret, flooding the magazines. The fifth hit amidships, collapsing an entire section of hull plating. Yamato shuddered and began to roll. In the lower decks, men trapped by rising water began to pray. Some sang the national anthem. Others called out the names of their families. The lucky few near escape hatches fought desperately to reach the upper decks before the ship turned turtle. Lieutenant Yoshimura, still in the engine room, felt the deck tilting beneath his feet. Water poured through ventilation grates in torrents. The emergency lighting failed, plunging the compartment into absolute darkness. He could hear metal groaning as the ship's structure began to fail. "Abandon ship! All hands abandon ship!" But there was nowhere to go. Yamato was 200 miles from land, surrounded by empty ocean. The escort destroyers were under attack themselves. Life rafts and boats had been destroyed by bombing. Most of the crew couldn't swim. At 2:20 p.m., the ship reached the point of no return. Her list passed 40 degrees. Water poured across the main deck in sheets. Men slid helplessly down the tilting steel plates, grasping for handholds that weren't there. The massive 18-inch gun turrets, each weighing 2,500 tons, began to shift in their mountings. When they broke free, they would roll through the ship like enormous steel balls, crushing everything in their path. Yamato was no longer a warship. She was a tomb for 2,700 men, sliding inevitably toward the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. At 2:23 p.m. on April 7, 1945, Yamato capsized and exploded. The final moments were captured by American reconnaissance aircraft circling overhead. The great battleship rolled completely over, her massive hull briefly visible above the waves before a catastrophic explosion tore her apart. The blast was so powerful it created its own weather, a mushroom cloud that rose 20,000 feet into the Pacific sky. The numbers tell a story of almost total annihilation. Of Yamato's crew of 2,767 men, only 276 survived. Captain Aruga went down with his ship, as did Admiral Ito and virtually every senior officer. The survival rate was barely 10%, worse than most infantry battles. Seaman Yoshida was one of the lucky few. Thrown clear when the ship exploded, he spent 14 hours in the oil-slicked water before being rescued by a Japanese destroyer. Years later, he would write, "I still dream of my friends trapped in those steel compartments. The water was so cold, but I knew they had died in fire and steam. I should have died with them." The escort ships fared little better. The light cruiser Yahagi was sunk with heavy loss of life. 4 destroyers went down. In total, Operation Tengo cost Japan over 4,000 sailors and accomplished absolutely nothing. Yamato never fired a single shot at the American fleet. For the Americans, it was a tactical masterpiece. They had sunk the world's largest battleship using only aircraft, losing just 10 planes and 12 aircrew in the process. The operation proved definitively that the age of the battleship was over. Naval warfare now belonged to aircraft carriers and their planes. But the human cost haunted both sides. American pilot Lieutenant Russell Reiserer later recalled, "We knew we were making history, but watching that ship die, seeing all those men in the water, it wasn't glorious, it was just terrible." The wreck of Yamato lies 1,120 feet beneath the surface, approximately 200 miles southwest of Kyushu. Japanese diving expeditions in the 1980s found the hull broken in two, the forward section resting upright on the seabed. Personal effects, rice bowls, chopsticks, sake cups, were scattered across the ocean floor, silent testimony to the lives lost. Yamato's sister ship, Musashi, had been sunk 6 months earlier at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Together, these two vessels represented the pinnacle of battleship design and the end of an era. No nation would ever again build ships of their size and power. Today, Yamato serves as a symbol of Japan's failed military ambitions and the futility of technological superiority without strategic wisdom. Her name appears on memorials across Japan, honoring the courage of men who died following orders they knew were suicidal. The last great battleship had become the ocean's grandest grave. 78 years later, commercial fishing vessels still occasionally snag their nets on something massive resting on the Pacific floor. The fishermen don't know they're touching the remains of Yamato, a monument to the 2,500 sailors who chose duty over survival, honor over life. The ship's bell, recovered decades after the sinking, now rests in a memorial hall in Kure, Japan. Visitors often leave flowers and sake, traditional offerings for the dead. The bell bears an inscription in classical Japanese for the eternal peace of the empire. That peace never came through victory. It came through surrender, just 4 months after Yamato's death. The massive battleship that was supposed to save Japan had instead become a symbol of her defeat, proof that courage and technology mean nothing without wisdom. In the end, Yamato's crew found their immortality not in victory, but in the terrible beauty of their sacrifice. They sailed into certain death because honor demanded it, carrying with them the dying dream of an empire that could no longer distinguish between bravery and madness. Some stories are too important to forget. This was one of them.